Spencer Klavan is a scholar, writer, and podcaster and has harbored a lifelong devotion to the great works and principles of the West. After studying Greek and Latin as an undergraduate at Yale, he spent 5 years at Oxford University to earn his doctorate in ancient Greek literature. Now an editor at the Claremont Institute, he has written for many outlets, including The Atlantic, The Los Angeles Times, City Journal, Newsweek, the Claremont Review of Books, The Federalist, The American Mind, and The Daily Wire. And now in his book, How to Save the West, Ancient Wisdom for 5 Modern Crises, Spencer Klavan sounds the alarm on the West cultural decline, and the Oxford-educated classicist turned Daily Wire host has a plan to save it. Spencer, thank you for coming on Faith and Focus. And may I say, it sounds like you pick up foreign or ancient languages and foreign languages like you or I or someone else would pick up a gallon of milk. How many languages do you know?
Oh, man. Well, Dennis, thank you so much for having me on. I have been asked this question before, and to be perfectly honest with you, I'm never quite sure what the current tally is, because sometimes I will pick something up. Like for a while, I got pretty interested in the Quran, and I became like decently, I could read in classical Arabic, but I don't know that I could do that now. So I usually kind of hover it around 10 or so things that I could like read passably. But that just makes me sound like such a jerk that I try not to talk about it whenever possible.
All righty. Well, yeah, we'll cut that out later. We won't include that one in here. So,
no,
right.
Please go right ahead.
All right. So from the intro to the book, we'll start off with this. It says, quote, a crisis in Greek, my Greek's not as good as yours, is a moment of conflict between two radically different and irreconcilable ways of looking at the world. I believe we face 5 essential crises today, end quote. So kind of sounds like some self-evident truths that our culture is founded on are not so self-evident anymore, which is dividing our culture. What are these 5 crises? If we can start there, just give us a rundown of what those are.
Sure. Yeah, you've really struck at the heart, I think, of why I wrote the book, because the word crisis gets tossed around all the time, right? We're having a crisis in shipping, we're having a crisis in housing prices, whatever. And these are all bad things, no question. But the way that they come at us in the news cycle, it just feels like this barrage of massive structural problems. And when I hear from people who listen to my podcast or who read the work that I write, I sense a ton of despair because people look at this series of just ever worsening news stories and they think, what can I do? How can I contribute? Because I want to be a good and meaningful citizen in the world, and I want to help. But they think about that question usually, I think, as if they were like Ron DeSantis. Like people imagine, like, what law am I going to write tomorrow that's going to save the country, capital C, or, fix the state or whatever. And that produces this despair because people don't actually have that kind of power. I don't have that kind of power. I assume you don't either. You're not like holding the keys to a State Department.
If I have it, it's late and I don't know about it.
That's right. Yeah, I'll be the last to find out if I ever get like that kind of power. But thank God we have the vote. That's wonderful. But there's got to be more than that. And so the point of the book basically is to say, actually, underneath these daily news stories, which just seem kind of disorienting, there are incredibly fundamental questions at stake about human existence, who we are, and what our role is in the universe. And those questions, although they are profound, are ancient and human-sized. And answering them well doesn't require you to like paint with this giant brush across the whole world. It actually requires you to get up in the morning and live out the ancient truths, the ancient verities in your life, to seek the true, the good, and the beautiful among your family members, in your community. So that's kind of what the book does, is it outlines some of these questions that lie underneath the news cycle. The first one is the crisis of reality. And that's the question of objective truth, which has been around as long as people have been thinking thoughts. I mean, this issue of we talk about fake news in the media all the time. We talk about social media censorship and who gets to say what. And we talk about virtual reality and the metaverse and this idea that actually it would be better, more convenient if we could just upload our minds into the cloud. And all of these raise this fundamental issue: is there anything that's objectively true, whether I want it to be or not, no matter how many people say otherwise, that right is right and wrong is wrong? And how can we know? And I present some of the best that I think has been thought and said on this, in many cases from the Greek tradition, affirming that in fact, yes, there is such a thing as objective truth. And if you want to have any shred of decency, if you want to treat people well, as we all sort of do instinctively, you need to affirm what Iris Murdoch said, which is that first fundamental realization that something other than oneself exists.
Right.
And this kind of leads into the second crisis, which is almost like the flip side of that. And that is, if there are these eternal truths, if there is something that we're yearning for beyond just the daily toss and churn of the here and now, why is it that we're held back by these decaying, corruptible bodies, right? This flesh which dies. This is also very ancient and yet incredibly modern, right? This kind of intense feeling that my body is actually less skillful and strong than that of my machines. I would like to be a different gender. I would like to have a computer chip implanted in my brain. And all of these things, promise freedom and deliver sickness, pain, and failure. And this is kind of what I argue.
And that was, and that was, just to interject, that was stuff that they wrestled with I'm obviously coming at this from like a biblical point of view. Like this were the things that they wrestled with because they were wrestling with it in Greek culture. You had certain sects that were saying, yeah, your body doesn't even matter at all. Do whatever you want with it. And it's like, hold on, wait a second. Corinthians in particular, maybe don't do whatever you want with your body. Let's rein this stuff in. So yeah, this was stuff that 2,000 years ago they were wrestling with.
Right. Everything is permissible, but not everything is helpful. Right. And this strain of, I wouldn't even, some people lay this at the feet of Plato himself, the kind of one of the great originators of the Greek philosophical tradition. I wouldn't put it at Plato's feet so much as at the feet of some of his disciples, which are the guys that the church was wrestling with precisely. Right. The Neoplatonists, the Gnostics, these folks who kind of want to transcend. I talk a lot in the book about Plotinus, who his biographer and his friend, his student, says he seemed ashamed of being in his body. He didn't even want to go to the baths, And so this is a part of the book, actually, where I really do start to uncover and dig into that patristic wisdom, the wisdom of the church fathers, and of Scripture itself as well. I talk about the West in terms of Athens and Jerusalem, these two great pillars of our civilization, one of them pagan, one of them coming from Greece, but the other, and the necessary kind of corrective to some of these excesses, is from Jerusalem, from the monotheists of the Near East, the Jews and the Christians. Aquinas kind of uncovers Aristotelian wisdom and baptizes it really about the body. Says, no, you're not like, it's not like you've got this kind of spark floating in some abstract ether and it's piloting a meat suit, which you hear people saying a lot online, right? Like you're a bone mech with meat armor or whatever. It's actually that your flesh is the language of your soul. Your soul is expressed in its embodiment. And that has all sorts of important consequences for what we should do right now, including that we should not be lopping off various body parts in some kind of misguided quest for perfection, right? And so that's kind of part two. That's the crisis of the body. Part three is the crisis of meaning, and part four is the crisis of religion. And I suspect your listeners are going to be particularly interested in that part. They're really going to like this section.
Right. Well, they're probably living it. Everyone's it's a disaster zone in the church, well, in religion in general. But I think folks might be interested in kind of what I offer in the book about this, because you think about, first of all, how we get to this point where we're talking about absolute truth. We're talking about the necessity of believing that something is true, whether you disagree or not, whatever. Right. It all kind of pushes you up against this wall with, well, okay, in order to salvage any shred of decency and social stability, we have to believe that there is a bedrock to reality. Right. And the question is then, can we? Because just because we need this thing in our mental architecture doesn't actually mean that it exists. And a lot of people think that for one reason or other, it's been quote unquote disproven that science has like moved beyond the rudimentary notion of God or Sky Daddy or what have you.
And the argument that I present in these two kind of core sections, the meaning crisis and the religion crisis, is that not only has science not disproven faith or religion, increasingly all of our science, all of our politics, all of our just life together requires religion to make sense of its discoveries and of our life. And so, I do not undertake, as Aquinas did, to offer proofs of the existence of God. You will not find the 5 ways here,
Sure.
Because really what I think is we're up against is something much more rudimentary. And this is something that evangelists could stand to think of. I think, that when you meet somebody who doesn't believe or doesn't know what he believes, the temptation, I know, for me, is instantly to be like, well, here's the Nicene Creed, and here are the 10 points of each of these things that you need to believe in right now, and here's why. And the problem is those things are all true, I believe, quite firmly, and yet people are not in a position to hear them yet. The first step is there absolute truth or not? And once you get there,
Yeah, and that I couldn't believe almost 20 years ago when I first went to Bible school, we were being taught, evangelism in a postmodern world. And so we had to read about postmodernism. And I just thought, there's no way people actually believe this, that there's no such thing as absolute. It's not possible. And then I was at a bonfire with some friends, and I ran into one of them and we were just talking about truth and the nature of truth. And I was saying truth exists, because she was saying, well, God doesn't exist because look at how many people believe in different versions of God. And I said, well, you're asking a different question. God is there and he is who he is regardless. What we're arguing about is what we might think about him. And so I said, we can't see past the light of this fire, but there is a red barn objectively over there. You might say it's not there. I say it is there. We can ask the person who lives here. They probably have a pretty good understanding of whether there's actually a red barn there. We might come to different conclusions, but when the light turns on, that barn will be there whether you believe it or not. And she said, no, if you don't believe it's not there, it's not there. And I just thought, well, the conversation's done at that point. I don't know how to talk to this person.
It's wild. I mean, it's a classic argument. She may or may not have known she was delivering the argument of the skeptics, not just we use that word to mean somebody that doubts a lot of stuff. But there is a philosophical school called skepticism, which consists in antiquity precisely of just laying out, well, you can argue A and you can argue not A. And both arguments persuade some people, and therefore there must be no truth. There's neither A nor not A. And I think college you was kind of right in a certain way when you said nobody really believes this stuff. Even your friend at the bonfire doesn't really believe it. And the way I know this is a story that I tell in the book from the ancient debates over this question. One of the followers of Heraclitus was this kind of a pre-Socratic philosopher who raised these doubts. Well, everything is constantly in flux. You can't step in the same river twice. This is a famous Heraclitus saying. And one of the things that Socrates points out is you can't be a halfway relativist. If you genuinely believe that, you can't have any sort of meaningful conversation. If you think that there is no truth about whether the barn is on the other side of the fire, then actually the words that you're saying are just meaningless screeches to the other person, because there's no basis for conversation if there's no reference that we have. And so one of Heraclitus' disciples ended up just realizing this conclusion and spent his whole life just moving his finger because he couldn't affirm or deny anything. He never spoke again. He just moved his finger around. People don't actually live that way. Your friend doesn't live that way. None of us do. And so what I say in the book about this is we ought to believe what we actually believe. We say we believe these things, but then we go away and we condemn people for what we believe to be moral failings. We argue and advocate for political positions. And implicit in all of this is the heart truth that we don't really believe this stuff because nobody can. It's not a workable way to live.
Well, and that's what you said that I thought was a really good, rather than if somebody says, I don't believe in God, rather than just hitting them with creeds, you kind of talked about, if a person is just dismissive of God, I don't even want to look into it, I don't want to investigate it, it's all hogwash, to challenge them with the idea that you actually do believe this, like you just said. You do believe this because you live it out. Why not at least be honest enough to investigate what you believe? Because you do believe it. You can't just say you don't. So you live as if God exists. So why not at least investigate and try to figure out who that is that you believe in, even though you might say that you don't?
Totally. I mean, this is kind of hard sometimes to get people to see because it's like the air that we breathe or the water that we swim in or whatever you want to use. But we are what Aristotle would call teleological beings. Like everything we do implies some aim or some good, because we act, we choose things, we do stuff in the world. And it's so baked into us that it's hard to see unless you really think about it. Well, okay, I got up out of bed in the morning, right? Why did I do that? Did I think that it was like, indifferent whether I stayed in bed or got up? No, I had something I wanted to do. I wanted to write this essay that I'm working on. And so I got up. It's like, why did I want to write the essay? Well, because I think it's making a good point. Well, why did I want to, and everybody has this if you kind of trace it down to its basis. And somewhere you got to say, well, because this is good, right? Because there is and you might be wrong. You might be fundamentally quite wrong about that. And you might be getting up in the morning to slaughter puppies and do some sort of nasty evil. But like, even if that's true, mankind does things because of what he believes to be good. And this is like fundamentally kind of theological.
Yeah. Even if you wake up and do bad things and purpose to do bad things, they're bad. So you try to hide them.
Yes. Yes. This is why the Hebrew Bible, this is why the Old Testament doesn't really actually talk about atheists. It talks about worshipers of other gods, right? Competitor gods to Yahweh, to the true God of Israel. And you see this all the time now. We think that we've kind of we have this kind of neutrality lie that we've scrubbed our public square free of religion, free of worship, and so forth. But if you look with, clear eyes at the way people behave, the way that Dr. Fauci talks about representing the science, embodying capital S science, right? That's the word of a cleric. That's not the argument of a man sort of thinking of himself humbly. And so, this is, maybe this leads into, since you asked about what the crises are, there is one left in the bag, and that is the crisis of the regime. The premise of the book, as I said, is that, you'll gain clarity on these political squabbles if you take a step back from them and ask what kind of central core questions are being raised by them. And so by the time you get to the end, then you can start to look at politics and say, well, what is the nature of the American regime? And that's really the question at the heart of this last section, because so many people can sense that like something is deeply wrong with American politics. Things are not working. We're not hearing each other. We're not talking to each other correctly. And what I argue essentially is that, there's this ancient thesis called anacyclosis, the cycle of regimes, in which there are these different kinds of living together, kinds of self-government, kinds of governing of others, ruling over others. And the three that Aristotle kind of proposes as natural are, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, or rule by the many. He has different names for it at different times. But the idea is, these each have a good side and a shadow side, because human action is always kind of capable of corruption. And so you start out, let's say, with a strong leader, maybe a military leader, becomes the king, and then his son is corrupt, right? And he becomes a tyrant. He rules for his own good. The natural thing that then happens is people rise up. The aristocracy, is unduly taxed, let's say, like the barons under King John, and they rise up and assert their rights. So often you'll then get like a kind of small group ruled by the few, the aristocrats, who have the same, temptations to corruption that all of us do, and end up, kind of passing on power among their cronies. And this is what you call an oligarchy in the classical formulation.
And then that might lead to what we might call systemic problems in a system, because then you've got multiple people setting up systems that are corrupted and doing corrupt things, and then and then the mob gets upset.
Very much so, especially because like the current situation that we're in is the decay, as I get into in the book. What we are in is a decaying republic. And republics decay most regularly into oligarchy. So the way this kind of works is, the people rise up, let's say, and they overthrow the corrupt oligarchy, and then you have rule by the many. But of course, this deteriorates into a wonderful word that we've kind of lost, ochlocracy, which is mob rule, rule by the ochlos. And mob rule is a form of chaos, and so into chaos enters another strong man, and this sort of cycle begins again. Our system, America, is supposed to be a perpetual motion machine that staves off these various forms of decay. It's called a republic. It consists in balancing these various forms of power against one another. And Machiavelli, who, despite his kind of nasty reputation, is probably the most astute analyst of this whole way of thought in early modern times, Machiavelli says that the thing that brings a republic down is class dissent, is fighting amongst the various classes, and extreme inequality, extreme aggregation of power into certain quasi-oligarchic groups. Like, all of this starts to sound uncomfortably familiar. Like, we look at our collars and we read it, because it's like, yeah, this is kind of where we're at. And then you can understand, like, why is it so pernicious when Joe Biden talks about a pandemic of the unvaccinated? Why is it such an evil to tell people that whites are inherently racist, men are inherently sexist, whatever? It's because it creates exactly this form of division.
My cat's trying to join the conversation. Sorry.
Sorry?
So my cat's trying to join the conversation. Sorry, I was pushing her out of the way.
We welcome cats here. I have a cat that shows up in the book, actually.
Oh, yeah. I noticed. I remember you mentioned it jumps up on your chair behind you. But yeah. But yes. So all these things just degenerate into, and we're starting to see that now with neo-Marxists, labeling, they're just, instead of using class, they're using identities and just these dispossessed people. Like, let's just get this mob together, basically. And yeah. I mean, it's important to recognize, I think, and this is something I point out in the book, that, when you start talking about Marxists, you start to sound like a kind of fusty conservative, like shaking his finger, like, these commies, they're taking everything over, and it kind of sounds like a holdover from the Cold War or something. Because as you point out, Marxism today in America as a mode of thought does not boil down to economic categories most directly, the way that it did in the actual thought of actual Marx, right? In point of fact, there was this turn in Marxism with the American New Left to shift the emphasis onto, social classes, forms of racial identity, sexual identity, and so forth. And so what you really have is a structural mental gesture, a thing that people do that kind of gives them away as having Marxist leanings, and that is the kind of reduction of argument, of actual good faith proposition, to material interests and pure power hunger, right? So you only deny that you're racist because you're so racist that you're trying to conceal it even from yourself, right? This is the Robin DiAngelo argument. And this is, textbook Marxism at a higher structural level, right? It's not just about, like, oh, you're the bourgeoisie or whatever. It's about you are whatever the disfavored class is. And this too destroys the possibility of rational argumentation, because, like, if I'm just saying what I'm saying because I'm a white man, and you're just saying what you're saying because you're a white man, and then what does it matter what we argue to one another? There's no possibility we'd ever change one another's mind. There's no way out of this trap, which is how it's designed. It's designed to foment revolution. Yeah. The only thing left to do is just overthrow whoever the powerful person is. That's the revolution. Just has to get the group to just overthrow things. So, so those are the 5 crises. And I appreciate it in the book how each chapter was, here's the crises, here's kind of how it applies to our lives today. This is what it looks like today. So it's kind of 2 parts. And I appreciate too, you've already said this, and maybe we can kind of transition into talking about this, because that to me it sounds overwhelming. It's like a couple of years ago, I think when I was graduating from Bible school and I thought I knew everything, I just thought, the church has so many problems, I've got to fix this. And then eventually I got to the point where I realized it's too big of a task. Like, I just have to work on who's in my immediate circle. And so when you see all of these crises and you think, and even as you're saying it, we talk about the American empire, that we've got imperial, forces around in every country, but you're talking about us as if we're a dying republic. Well, if we're looking at Rome, when the republic died, that's when the empire came on the scene. So it's actually kind of frightening if you think of it on a global scale. Like, wait, if we're just a dying republic, when the empire comes, that might not be a very pretty thing. It might be even worse than what we have now. And to me, that just is too overwhelming. But in the book, you break it down to, don't worry about that. That's not your job to save the world, even though, ironically, the book's called How to Save the West.
Right.
What is the solution? How do we boil it down to something that you or I or our neighbor can do?
Right. Well, the reason why the West is an ennobling and enriching concept, as contrasted with saving the world, right, which usually has something to do with, like, climate change is going to kill us all, and therefore we need to, like, make public every possible institution and seize the wealth or whatever. Harry Jaffa, who is the kind of intellectual godfather of the Claremont Institute where I work, he has this wonderful line where he says, the West is saved every time a single human heart is rescued from the dark night of nihilism and relativism. And one of the things that I point out in the book is that Western civilization, which is a tradition of thought and endeavor, has a habit of surviving its own demise. And that's precisely because it lives in the hearts and the daily actions of those individuals who take it unto themselves to seek the true, the good, and the beautiful. And that is a project which, you can do in any circumstance. I'm not saying it doesn't matter whether America falls, right? I think it's a matter of enormous importance, and we should all care about it and behave as passionately as possible to avert that catastrophe. But I am saying it's ultimately out of your control. You actually don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know what's going to happen 10 years from now. What I do know is that when the Roman Republic fell, you had guys like Cicero, right? Marcus Tullius Cicero, who is the great, articulator of a lot of these truths that I've been talking about, Republican government and so forth. And in the short term, Cicero fails. He fails terribly. The empire comes, the new regime enters in, he himself becomes a casualty of it. And he basically, if he were looking down the road, in the short term, he would have assessed himself as a complete failure. Until in the 1770s, along comes our man John Adams, who has since his boyhood pored over the speeches of Cicero and, at the crucial moment gives the speech in defense of the Declaration of Independence, which sets this country on the road to its genesis. And that, when you're talking in those terms, when you're looking at that long view of history, and when you understand yourself as an inheritor and a preserver of a tradition that lives across that many generations, you actually you have no cause for despair. You have no right to despair. You just have a job to do, and that is to be that guy, right, who wakes up every day and tries to show up for his kids and church and local community in such a way as to carry that flame.
Right. Yeah, and the reason you can look at all these crises and think there is no hope for America, for the West. But if you go back again to the reality and the fact of truth exists, beauty exists, goodness exists, which means God must exist. It must be pointing to someone beyond this. And if truth and beauty and goodness are just our understanding of God, God embodies those things. God's not going anywhere. So what's good and true and beautiful is going to continue. It's not, God forbid America falls, but really America is going to fall. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not 10 years from now, but it can't go on forever. And so if our hope is in preserving this thing rather than the good, the true, and the beautiful, like you said, well, then we're really placing our hope in something that's not very stable. So,
yeah, C.S. Lewis, in one of his works, I'm going to forget which one, he says, if you aim for heaven, you will get earth thrown in. But if you aim for earth, you will lose both. Yeah. And I think that's really kind of the rub of it right there. It's easy to, when you start talking about this stuff, it's easy to get accused of quietism or, apathy or what have you, because the political fights are so urgent,
Right.
But actually what we're both saying here, I think, is something quite different, which is that the things over which you have control are actually of even profounder urgency because they are you-sized. And surrendering the rest to God is leaving it in the best possible hands. And the only thing that you can actually do, everything else is just self-deception to say I'm going to fix this, and so, saving the West is actually a much more doable thing than saving, the country or the world.
Yeah. And it's just there's so many things in the Bible in the New Testament that confirm this. And I'm thinking of people will often read the New Testament and they'll think slavery is obviously evil. Why didn't Jesus just say no more slaves? Why didn't Peter, why didn't they just say no more slaves? God is going to make that happen in history. But his solution is not, hey, Paul, tell everyone to free all their slaves. His solution is to tell Paul to tell Philemon, hey, you release this one slave, Onesimus. Like this one thing. I can impact Philemon in his relationship with a slave. We're not going to overthrow slavery, though, in the Roman Empire. That's just not going to happen. We're going to be crushed at the outset. But this is how we're going to change the world, is by this one person, Philemon.
That's such a profound point. I love that point, because what it shows is something which goes, beyond even that question. And that is that because we live in time, because we are fallen creatures who die and who have limited, understanding, God, if he wants a relationship with us at all, an authentic relationship, must consent to live in time as well, which is precisely what he does in the incarnation, right? I mean, this is, and so, the things that we find appalling in even, say, the, wars that ancient Israel gets into in the Hebrew Bible, it might be that in some absolute sense, right, no loss of life ever is acceptable, and yet, if God were simply to hold us to that standard, who could stand, right? If the Lord should judge evil, that would mean the obliteration of the human race, or even just never making humanity to begin with. And so we fall into this same trap, people who abandon this notion that humanity has fallen, that we're striving over time, over centuries, fall into this trap of what I call chronological chauvinism, where it's like you look back and you say, well, yeah, these guys were evil. The founders were evil. They held slaves, or, the Stone Age texts of the Hebrew Bible are just, pure superstition. It's like, well, the only reason that you even have language to make that moral condemnation is because gradually over the course of centuries, the conditions emerge, or men could see this, and the people who fought and argued and read and taught about this stuff worked their way to the place where you can sit up on your high horse. So maybe don't toss maybe don't toss the greats out.
Yes. Yeah. No kidding. And so, okay. So yeah, don't throw the greats out. These people that wrote a long, long time ago, people, especially Christians, I think they get sometimes bent out of shape about, well, we should only, maybe we fall into like kind of the Pauline Corinthian, we should only follow Christ or Paul or Peter, stop this Plato nonsense. Who cares about any of that stuff? But what I thought was interesting was, well, first of all, in the New Testament, Paul is always quoting, well, not always, but he's quoting other philosophers of the day. So he's not specifically pulling from the Hebrew Bible. But you said in the book, and I want to kind of ask your opinion on this, because it's Plato, Aristotle, but then I'm like, that's like Bible too. You said possible economic resentment is, quote, why Plato suggested that rulers at least should live in a state of total koinonia. And that's a word that jumped out to me, a Greek word meaning having things in common. But Aristotle says that phileo, love, is what binds people together, not radical sharing of goods and family. The early church, though, seemed to bring both of those things together. That koinonia existed in Acts 2 and Acts 4. One of the ministries that I run with InFaith is this house I live in called Koinonia House. So it seems like Plato is saying we just got to have this communism. Aristotle's saying, no, we need to have love. And you said, it sounds like what Aristotle's saying is that you have the love first for your brother, your friend, your family, your community. And out of that grows koinonia, which it seems like that's what the early church was able to bring together. We love because he first loved us. That brought this koinonia. And even the language that I think it was Aristotle used, labor of love, Hebrews 10:6 says, God is not unjust to forget your work and labor of love, which you have shown towards him. So I'm like, yeah, I don't know that you can necessarily throw away Plato and Aristotle and these people, because they were informing the authors of the New Testament.
Well, right. I mean, I think what I say about that passage from Aristotle is that, they both use the word koinonia. It's really interesting. Koinonia is just a Greek word for having things in common, basically. Yeah. And Socrates in the Republic, and of course you can debate endlessly whether Plato really meant to endorse this or just to kind of float it, or in what way this is being put forward, but Socrates proposes a kind of koinonia that has to do with sameness, with holding even wives in common, right? At least among the guardian class, the kind of elite, you're going to get just like total, everything is everyone's, right? You'll own nothing and you'll be happy.
Yeah.
And
kind of see that like Jim Jones type cults too. Everyone owns everything, and all of your wives are my wives. All your wives belong to
surprise,
us.
It boils down to exactly all your wives belong to us. Yeah, that's right. And this is what Aristotle says, which is so astute and remains really apt, is that this kind of koinonia is like taking a little drop of wine and diluting it among a big vat of water. You think that you're going to get like a big vat of wine, but what you actually get is just really, really weak wine that you can't even taste because it's spread out over so much territory. And love is like that. You actually can't love like all of these wives sort of at once with the same intensity. You have to love this wife, you have to love this house and this family. And so then you have this kind of new form of koinonia that emerges out of particularity, and particularity breeds relationship, right? Like, and this is the point of the body of Christ, I think, as Paul is saying, we are these distinct, irreducible individuals who are nevertheless constitutive of a whole, which is far, far greater than us, and which it persists in a kind of identity. I mean, shall the eye say to the hand, I am not part of the body because I am not a hand? Like, you have an identity in the community, in the koinonia of the Christian church, which is in some sense makes you the same, or at least your brother's gifts are your gifts in some fundamental way, and that kind of sharing, which preserves the individual love of like, well, it's actually, I prefer that there be people in the church who are better than me at such and such a thing because I delight in them as somebody else, Right. And this is, I think, the big mistake that we always make. We think that equality means sameness. We think that sharing means communism, basically. Yeah. And I think it's something very, very different that the biblical authors are talking about. And it's also something different that the classical tradition sort of arrived at through that debate.
Yeah. And I think, bringing it back, you mentioned the body of Christ. We all, in a sense, Paul even says, we are members of one another. We belong, there's this belonging to one another. So having an apathy where it's just like, you've got your problems. I don't care. It's like, well, hold on. If one part of the body hurts, we all hurt. If you stub your toe, you're in pain. Like, it's not just your toe that's in pain. You are in pain. So if someone's hurting, it's like there is an element where like, I can't just ignore that. This is my business in a sense because we are all members of one another. I have to, in love, come alongside you and challenge you or exhort you or encourage you or whatever it might be. And so to bring this to what you said at the end, like the way we save the West isn't necessarily divorced from like my struggle of like, how do you save the church? And then again, ignorantly thinking, well, that's not my responsibility. Jesus said the church is going to be built. It's not going anywhere. But what's my responsibility? My responsibility is to the members of the body of Christ around me. And so what I've been trying to teach people that I minister to is you have a role. You have a position in the body of Christ. Like the church, it's struggling in America. Isn't going to get better because you get a better pastor or you go to a conference and you learn something. It's going to be because you learn to embody the life of Christ in koinonia and in relationship with that other person.
Yeah, that's so crucial. It's key. There's this wonderful book called The Centuries of Meditations by Thomas Traherne, who's a Christian mystic. And he begins sort of by meditating on the way in which God has things. We say that God, the whole world is God's. Mm-hmm. And Traherne makes this beautiful observation that the whole world is God's, but he doesn't possess it the way a kind of jealous landowner does. That is, he doesn't control our brain. He has every right to like turn us into automatons and occupy our brains and do, but that's not actually the way that he has anything. He has it by experiencing it fully, by delighting in it, right? Even as something other. And this is how we come to possess the world as God's gift. All of creation, says Traherne, belongs to you. And you're like, well, no, it doesn't. But actually it does because you have eyes, right? Like because you have eyes and senses, the whole of this beauty that God has made, in some sense, belongs to you, and it can belong to you while also belonging to every other human being in the world. Right. And it follows also that your brother is yours, right? That he, in some sense, you belong to one another in this incredibly profound way. Everything that is good about him is yours, and all of his pain also is kind of, for you to grieve over, grieve with those who are in sorrow and rejoice with the rejoicing, and once you grasp that, it's like the whole world is made anew in every human soul, and yet it's made anew also for you, and like we're not these little atomized entities. We're actually in a kind of quantum entanglement with one another.
Sure.
Which is, and like you are going to do more for the world, even if you focus on the particularity of your brother, than you would ever for going and carrying a picket sign somewhere.
Yeah, but it sounds so counterintuitive. That's why I think at the conclusion of this book, it hits at such a, it's such a profound, like, kind of gut punch, because you're outlining all of these crises, and they are millennia old. They're with us. They seem to be increasing. It's like, okay, how do you save the West? Oh, just be a better person, be a friend to some, it's like, it sounds like, so it's like, and to go to Jordan Peterson, the 12 rules for life, his things, making your bed. That's why those tropes are so powerful, because it's like, what does that really matter if I'm just a better person, a better friend? How's that going to save the West? But ironically, in God's kind of upside down economy, that's what does it.
Absolutely right. Yeah, it's like, why should making your bed have this relation to like the cosmic notions of order and chaos? And yet it actually works. It's true, and this is the secret, I think, to everything, right? Diluting your little drop of wine in water versus actually pouring it into some vessel that's designed to hold it, to kind of extend that metaphor. Yeah, the way forward, the way to save the West is to save to look to the salvation of your own soul first.
Yeah, I completely agree. And this is also, too, to tie it back, I think it's the reality or the body one that you talk a lot about, virtual reality and the onset of virtual. And I've been kind of like, for probably about 10 years, but I've been kind of amping it up now with like Neuralink and everything that's coming along. I'm just seeing more in the metaverse. And now that there's disinformation, misinformation, people can't understand on the internet, even as it is now in its infancy, what's true and what's not true. And I'm like, once you slap something on your face and you're living in augmented reality all the time, you are not going to know reality and truth from lies. And so I've been trying to tell people, like, you better get used to when the Bible says not forsaking the assembling and just getting together and interacting with somebody's actual body in the real world, because there's going to come a point where it's like you're either in virtual reality land or you're just like, I don't know, some Amish, meeting in person with somebody. So like, you better get used to it, because I think that's coming down the pike for sure.
Oh, I completely agree. I think there is a way in which like we're going to split without splitting. Like we'll occupy the same space, but like the human race will be composed of like almost two completely distinct groups having two different experiences of the world. And I know which one I want to be in. The embodied reality is kind of what I'm plunking on. Sounds like you are too.
If it's good enough for God, I mean, he embodied a body, so I mean, it's got to be good enough for us. But
I guess exactly.
But like, I've told people, I said, I'm not telling you where you got to draw the line, but I know I went from having a flip phone to a smartphone. It's going to just suck you in. I said, I'm not doing anything that requires me to wear it on my face. That's where I'm drawing the line. I'm not doing any virtual reality, because I know as soon as I get that Oculus, whatever, I'll be in the metaverse in 10 years or something. So
true enough. I know just the video games alone that they make on that thing are just so immersive. And I mean, you always know there is a third person view of this, right? Like this is the thing that destroys it always, as you think, the world will become a place of wonders if I put this thing on my face. It's like, sure, but like, there will be such a thing as a person who can look at you, right, from the outside. And you have to believe that that's true, or else everything else falls apart.
Yeah. Well, and we see that already with, all these tech Silicon Valley types who don't let their kids engage in this thing. So it's like, when you're plugged into the metaverse, Mark Zuckerberg is going to be out of it watching what you're doing inside of it, which, like 100%. that kind of terrifying concept that, yeah, there's somebody watching what's going on. So, well, Spencer, we're up to 45 minutes. As I said, I wanted to be respectful of your time and not keep you. I could probably pick your brain forever. Hopefully this hasn't been a nightmare for you. Maybe you can come back sometime in the future and I can pick your brain about biblical Greek or something like that.
Oh, absolutely. It's been the very opposite of a nightmare. Such a delight. And yeah, we could go on forever, but I'll sign off for now, and we'll do it again soon.
All righty. Thanks, Spencer.
Thank you.
While Faith in Focus is a ministry of mine as a missionary within Faith, the views and opinions expressed, believed, or lived out by myself or those appearing in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the positions, beliefs, or opinions of InFaith as a mission.